Today we're going to talk about dominant chords, and not in the typical sense of the primary dominant or even secondary dominants. Today we're going to look at more obscure dominant chords like special function dominants. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're in the key of C major and you see a D7 chord. Typically the next chord is G7, it's functioning as the 5 of the 5 chord. But what about the rare instances where that D7 precedes a 1 chord? What's going on there and why is that working? How is that chord functioning? That's what we're going to talk about today. But let's first go over typical dominant function. In any given major key, your 5 chord, in this case G7, has dominant function because it has an expectation to resolve down a perfect fifth. That motion combined with the resolution of the tritone interval to the root and the third of the 1 chord is what tonicizes that 1 chord. This is the foundation of all tonal music. But you can have a dominant chord on any degree precede the 1 chord, but they're going to have different functions and they all have different feels to them. Let's check them out. The first chord is your 1 dominant 7th chord. This is your tonic blues chord, and it's what we call a special function dominant because it doesn't resolve or have an expectation to resolve down a perfect fifth. Typically in the blues context, your 1 chord, your 5 chord, and your 4 chord are all dominant chords, but none of them are functioning as a typical dominant chord. Number 2 is flat 2 dominant 7. This is what we call a tritone substitution. It shares the same tritone as the 5 chord, and since that tritone still resolves in the same way to the root and third of the 1 chord, you can substitute this for the 5 chord, and it still resolves to the 1 chord quite nicely. The main difference is that instead of root motion down a fifth, you have root motion down a minor second. Number 3 is your 2 dominant 7th chord. If you're writing modal music, this would be your Lydian cadence chord. But if you're writing tonal music and you sort of borrow this chord, it would be acting as a special function dominant since it doesn't have the expectation to resolve down a fifth. Number 4 is flat 3 dominant 7. This one's pretty obscure, but you could use it in a blues context as it has a root built on a blue note, but it could also be taken from the axis system, which is derived from the symmetrical dominant scale and essentially connects 4 chords, all a minor third apart, that share the same tritone and can sort of be swapped out for each other with varying effects. Number 5 is 3 dominant 7. This can be looked at a couple of different ways. It could be a constant structure chord in a blues context. It could function as the 5 of the 6 chord, resolving deceptively to 1 because they share so many common tones as well as tonic function. Or it could be taken from the axis system, this time from the perspective of the dominant axis. Number 6 is your 4 dominant 7th chord. In a modal environment, this will be your Dorian modal cadence chord, and the 1 chord would be minor. If, however, the 1 chord is a dominant chord, then it has subdominant blues function. Number 7 is flat 5 dominant 7. This one's also a little bit more obscure, but it acts as a special function dominant in the context of a blues as it has a root built on a blue note. You could also use the axis system from the perspective of a dominant 1 chord and unify the chords with the symmetric dominant scale. Number 8 is flat 6 dominant 7, and this functions as an altered subdominant minor modal interchange chord. Ugh, I know, but it's not actually as complicated as it sounds. Modal interchange is when you borrow a chord from a parallel mode. Let's take C minor. In C minor, the flat 6 chord is A flat major 7, and it has subdominant function. So if you borrow it in C major, you have a subdominant minor modal interchange chord. Well, if you then take 1 degree, in this case the 7th, and you flat it or alter it, you now have an altered subdominant minor modal interchange chord. Number 9 is 6 dominant 7. This typically acts as the 5 of the 2 chord, but in rare instances you will see it precede a 1 chord, and the reason that it works is because it's a reharmonization of a descending diminished chord, the D flat diminished 7. That resolves because of common tones and chromatic voice leading. It can also be taken from the axis system from the tonic axis. Now, out of the list of the 4 chords that you get using that system, this will be the weakest. Part of the reason is because the tritone is split between chord sound and tension sound, and the other reason is because the bass moves in thirds, which is the weakest bass motion. Something you can do to help that is to use an inversion of the chord. In first inversion, for example, the bass would move down a second instead of down a third. Number 10 is flat 7 dominant 7. This is diatonic to minor key harmony, but it's dominant in quality only, because it lacks the leading tone of the typical 5 chord, and the way the tritone resolves, combined with the fact that the root moves up a whole step instead of down a fifth, makes this more of an elaborated subdominant minor cadence. And finally, we have 7 dominant 7. This is a reharmonization of the tonic auxiliary diminished chord, and is another example of a dominant chord that resolves not because of dominant function, but because of chromatic voice leading. There you have 11 dominant chords that are not the 5 chord. Some of these are really cool, and some of them you're probably never going to use, but it's good to know anyway, just in case there comes a time where you want to do something really weird in your music. That's going to do it for today. See you next time.